So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. We think this is the fifth one in our series of Secrets Revealed talks, the fourth one that John has done. And this one is all about the history of Kingsholm. This is quite a long presentation, so I think there's going to be slightly less time than we often have for questions at the end. If you would like to submit a question through the chat function on Zoom, please do that and I'll collate those and ask John at the end. John's also happy to be interrupted if you've got a question that just can't wait until the end or you don't know how to use the chat function. We're going to ask that you put yourself on mute while John's talking, because otherwise the background noise can be a little bit distracting. So I think we're good to go. Thanks once again for joining us. I'm going to hand over to John now, and he's going to talk to us about Centurions, Kings and Captains.
Hello everybody, thanks for coming along. As Kate said, this talk's all about the history of Kingsholm. It's arguably the most famous area in Gloucester, thanks primarily to the cherry and white, so I'm sure we all know and love. But actually it has got a really long history, and it includes a wide range of diverse subjects: Roman fortresses, Anglo-Saxon palaces, agriculture, highwaymen, industrial manufacturing, and a lot more. So we're going to take a very broad sort of look at this history, and find out what it has. And I have to admit, at the start of this talk, I was almost scrabbling for material, but all of a sudden I found a rich vein of stuff, so the talk sort of expanded. So we'll get through it sort of reasonably quickly. It will of course later on be put online so you can view it. So let's have a quick start. Probably one of the most interesting things which you probably don't know is we know that Kingsholm lies on the edge of the Severn floodplain. It's about a kilometre, half a mile or so from the river today. But prior to the 1500s, it actually flowed much closer to Kingsholm, only about 400 metres away, 200-300 yards. And that's roughly marked by what is today known as the Dockham Ditch. Also, it took in the modern St Oswald's Park and eventually went round to Lower Westgate Street. So on the map here, this is the 1881 map. I've just sort of put in those blue squares, which roughly shows the flow of the River Severn at the time. It all changed about 1483 when there was a major flood event, which is recorded, and the Severn basically broke through its levee banks at the top of what we would now call sort of the East Channel, and it started flowing down on a different route. And of course, after that, the old Severn, as they called it, began to silt up, and eventually just became Dockham Ditch and a little bit today. So that's sort of always worth bearing in mind. You had this big river right on the edge of Kingsholm, which is fairly low lying. We know the human history probably began in the Mesolithic period, about 9,000 years ago, although there is evidence of much older activity in Barnwood, Paleolithic. And we're basically thinking that you're going to get seasonal hunter-gatherers travelling up and down the Severn, and they're going to be using inlets such as the Twyver to get inland. We've got this area in Wales, the Innis Hir wetlands. Apologies for any Welsh speakers who said I pronounced that wrong, I probably have done. And that they think today that's a pretty good idea of what the sort of Severn estuary around our area looked like. So it was very much a tree landscape, with some marshes and scrub. And the gentleman on the right hand there in the coracle is Chris Park. He's a very good specialist in bees and beehives at the moment, but he also does sort of historic reenaction as well. Currently, the oldest archaeological find in Kingsholm is this beautiful barbed and tanged flint arrowhead, which was found in the excavations ahead of building the BMW car dealership. Most people will know that as Richard Cound. Found in 1987. Dates from the Bronze Age, about 4,000 years ago. It's got a broken tip and has lost one barb. So it probably has been lost in a hunting exhibition of some sort. And the other two images there are probably what these sort of arrow would have looked like. Coming to the Iron Age, there's no real, at the moment, evidence of occupation, but it's strongly suspected that a sort of settlement grew up around the river crossing at Kingsholm. By the Iron Age, we're pretty sure that you have sort of these round houses on the raised gravel spurs that were close to the river. So we're pretty sure there was some sort of crossing there. Some evidence we know comes from this because we have found trust say we, the royal we, tribe, coins from the local Bunny tribe, and also the Durotriges tribe, who are sort of much further south from Wessex to Somerset. They've been found in the area, as well as some Iron Age pottery. Most of these have come from what is known as Coppice Corner, which is now called Gambier Parry Gardens, the southern end of Sandhurst Lane, all around there. And there's been an awful lot of archaeological work done around this area, but it's all piecemeal, as we'll see later. One of the most interesting things is they did find what they've interpreted as a Celtic pit shrine here. So it hinted at some sort of ritual water use. So, you know, maybe was this evidence for our first goddess, Sabrina Severn? We don't know, but it'd be interesting to sort of find out, although we probably won't find any hard evidence for it. The quantity of the Iron Age material in that area suggests that there was a settlement, and it might have been a market. This is one of the theories proposed for it, cited to take advantage of the river crossing. And this might have been why the Romans, who arrived soon afterwards, set up the first fort in Kingsholm, primarily to guard this crossing, and so they could control it. D49. The Roman armies, the Valeria Victrix 20th Legion, or elements of it, we don't really know for sure, arrived in Kingsholm straight from Colchester to set up a base in the area. Because this was on the edge of the known territory then, it was the frontier zone for the Romans. You know, the proximity to the river, easy access into Wales, they're allowed to control traffic going across the river, but also moving up and down it. And there is probably some trade going on like this. And of course, the picture on the right there is the fantastic Urban Street Guard. If you've not ever seen them, do go and see them. That they're a wonderful organisation for reenacting Roman period. What would the locals have thought? Well, the Legion must have been highly diverse at this time. You'd have had men from the Balkans, Italy, Germany, Spain, probably from North Africa as well. So I make no excuses to using this fantastic little bit of Asterix cartoon from the Asterix the Legionnaire, you know, just to show us what sort of people the locals might have seen. But we don't think there is much or any fighting around this area because the Bunny tribe were relatively pro-Roman, so their territory was not intensely garrisoned in the aftermath of the Roman invasion. And I'll put a little plug in here for a talk that is coming up on the Low History Festival about the sort of the history of the Roman army in Gloucestershire. I can't remember the exact name of the talk, but it's Neil Holbrook's given it. It'll be a very good talk. I'm going to it, so I'd suggest if you're interested in this period, it'd be good to go have a look at the site and book it up as well. So, because Kingsholm is so built up, there's only limited archaeological information available. In 1865, the old Gloucester City Excavations Unit did do an investigation in a large plot of land at the bottom of Sandhurst Lane, and this revealed a section of the sort of Romans fort's defences, which has allowed archaeologists to produce this rough but probably accurate location for the fort. And it was quite a large one. You can see how it spans over that area. Again, which we probably never will find much of this stuff, but it's still there. You know, fingers crossed we might find more positive evidence soon. The original fort was probably what they call a vexillation fortress. You know, it was just a fairly small one with fairly simple earthen defences, sort of like the picture there with one or more outer ditches. You know, the Romans, I don't think, were too bothered about whether they were going to get attacked at this time, but their procedure, their systems for the military set up this. However, later on, it was expanded into a full-sized legionary fortress. So that's built of stone. It was large enough to hold about 5,000 legionaries, probably an equal number of auxiliary troops. So this would have been, you know, this big stone structure, this massive fort, must have made quite an impact on the locals, I would think. Well, the reason for this, well, we think it was probably because at this time it was a really strategic area and it could have supported the sort of information and also goods and trade and sort of supplies going into the Roman campaigns in Wales. Around about this time, the Romans started moving into Wales, which is where they ran into all sorts of problems with Caractacus and the Siluria tribe, who were the ones in the forest. Still the same today, I'm told. What do the legionaries make of the weather? Well, I love this picture from the old Gadarg research group. It's Phil Moss's drawing, so thanks to Phil for letting us use this. And it sort of sums up what the Romans might have thought about the weather. You know, pretty much rain, very soggy area. I think Carry On Cleo got it right as well. And I love this line. The guard can hail Mark Antony. Mark Antony, who's obviously Sir James Blight's hail, snow, sleet, thunder, lightning, the lot. What a country, you know, which is a great little bit. And again, I'm sure we all know and love that film. Having said that, though, around about 64-49 OD, so not many years after they arrived, the fortress at Kingsholm was dismantled and a new one was built on higher ground about a kilometre to the south. This, of course, would later become Colonia Nerva Glivenzum, the city of Gloucester as we know it today. It used to be thought that this was just purely down to seasonal flooding. So Kingsholm area was going to get too wet. It was difficult to move around. But now there's an argument that it was actually moved to give the Roman sort of troops a better command of the Severn crossing. And again, this map from the Cotswold archaeology, shows the lines of the Roman road and the relative positions of the Kingsholm fort in the city centre fortress. Following the sort of demolition of the Kingsholm fortress, the Romans actually left it. It probably returned to agriculture, but later on, the whole area began to be used as a cemetery, Roman cemetery. And Roman law, as we may or may not know, required burials to be outside official limits of urban land. So Roman cemeteries towns are often surrounded by cemeteries. At Gloucester, we've got lots. We've got them identified along the roads coming to the south and east gates, to round about the Kingsholm area and the Wootton area. The latter two appear to be the earliest ones, but they also continued until the sort of the late Roman period. They are probably originated for people, actually soldiers who died actually when the earlier sort of fortress was there. Roman artifacts began to be discovered in Kingsholm when they were doing gravel extraction in the late 18th century. There's not many records of this, and surprisingly, for what we know about Gloucester today, prior to this time, they really didn't know if there were Romans in Gloucester at all. It was very rare to find anything. But as soon as development started, as soon as they started, these things began to pick up, and antiquities would often find this stuff, and they realized there was actually lots of burials in the area. Currently, there are known about 300 to 400 cremation inhumation burials. It's thought that there's over 1,000 here, and they do date in range in time from the 1st to the 4th century. So it's a span of over 350 years. So it's a long period of time that they were utilizing these areas for burials and inhumations. Gods of Kingsholm, not quite the 2002-2003 Power Gen Cup winning team we all know and love, but there are a series of Roman altars found in Kingsholm. These are now at the Corinium Museum. It's got 5 broken ones. They were found in Kingsholm area in 1876 and are thought to have come from a large shrine that existed there. We know one is dedicated to the god Mars, which is the one at the top there. It's got a partial inscription on. The inscriptions on these things are very often fragmented and abbreviated. Most interesting one, though, is the one below it, which records an auxiliary army cohort at Kingsholm, possibly made up of Celtic soldiers. It's got this Celtic personal name, Moravindus. It's been interpreted to read to the god, the genus of the whole cohort, Moravindus, which is a really interesting, gives an interesting snippet. Were there already sort of local British or Britain soldiers actually there at the time? At the same time in this thing, they found this beautiful Romano-British head of the goddess Ceres Fortuna was found. She was closely associated with burials, so it's not surprising there was something there. And all these are on at the Corinium Museum. So, if you will thoroughly recommend it. The Roman galleries are fantastic. 1972, archaeologists were working on they found a site in Kingsholm, working on it, and they found what they thought was a late Saxon burial next to a sort of Roman mausoleum, remains of one. But the grave goods in the Saxon burial didn't work out. It was too early for a Saxon. So they basically they thought, well, this looks Eastern European, we'll give this chap a nickname, the Goth. And they actually got the button right. It was interpreted as a high status Roman soldier or administrator who was happened to be billeted at Gloucester during the last decades of Roman rule. And recently there's been a fair amount of work done on this chap, and scientific tests have now proven that he was a Goth, as it were. So he'd been born in a cold region of Central Eastern European, so Hungary, Western Romania or Eastern Poland. They've also discovered that he was in his 40s when he died, and he was also partly vegetarian, a lot of vegetarian stuff and less meat. And his presence is one of the really unusual, unique elements of the Kingsholm Roman cemeteries, which are otherwise so pretty bog standard as these things go. And the facial reconstruction there was undertaken just to sort of these beautiful things they do. And this is what they thought he looked like. We don't know about their hair, obviously. So So this is some of the finds that have been found over the years at Kingsholm. Got this beautiful copper brooch, early second century. You've got the bone hair comb, which is absolutely beautiful, which is a late 4th century one. And you've got a coin of Constantine there. So, you know, if you do happen to live in Kingsholm and dig in your garden, keep your eyes out for things like this, because they might well be there. Of course, if you do find anything, report it to the PAS, the Portugal Archaeological Scheme. Kurt is the local guy we can speak to, and we have his details if you ever need them. This is an interesting little bit. One discovery in the Roman cemetery at Kingsholm was that 7 of the skeletons were buried face down. It's known, these are not unknown in Roman context, but what's interesting is folk legends, especially from the medieval times onwards, and especially in Eastern Europe, say that this was the deliberate action to prevent the dead from walking or returning as vampires. Now, what I find interesting here is we know that the Romans believed in vampires, and they also believed in ghosts. And with an Eastern European connection established in Gloucestershire, in Gloucester, you know, one wonders whether they had a concern over vampires in the area as well. Again, I think that's going to be the base for some great stories and tales, perhaps, and maybe even some out there already. Moving on to the Saxon period. By the 600s, Gloucester was under the control of the Wiki, which is one of the Mercian tribes, and it's known from this time that an Anglo-Saxon great hall, usually described as a palace, existed at Kingsholm. It also, interestingly, it respected the Roman alignments as well. We know there are ancillary buildings, including a chapel, and by the time we had the Confessor, it was described as the Great Hall of the Royal Manor at Kingsholm, and was a meeting place of the King's Great Council, the Wittangiament. And that helped raise Gloucester's status to equal that of Winchester and London. The picture there on the inside, obviously it's a reconstruction. It's from a Danish site, which they now identified as Herod from Beowulf. And that's the idea. We think it might have looked something like this. We don't know, but you can imagine it'd be quite posh if the king's going to be there. We think the hall was built of timber, probably very similar to the Cheddar Saxon hall here, which you can see today at the Avalon Marshes Centre in Somerset. But around about the 12th century, we think, 11th century, sorry, we think it was rebuilt in stone. This is the same time as the gates, Gloucester gates, and the Abbey was rebuilt in stone. So it seems likely if you've got this big important building, that would be done as well. We know the early Norman kings used the Kingsholm Great Hall as residence until, you know, about 1100s, when it was sort of superseded by Gloucester Castle. And there's a very, very good argument to suggest that it was from this Great Hall that William I ordered the Domesday Book. You'll find Gloucester Cathedral will also say, hang on a minute, no, they ordered it from here, but they actually confirmed the book. There was a meeting there and they confirmed that this it's in question be done. So we think William actually ordered it from the Kingsholm Hall. Today, we think the archaeologists think the Great Hall is around about located on the Kingsholm Close. So on the enclosure map here, which you can see online on Know Your Place, it's fields 122, 129. There has been occasional work there, and they found sort of timber settings interpreted as sort of, you know, post holes and actually beds for where timbers would be put. We know that the chapel survived into the 1300s, but amazingly, there's been no worked stone has ever been found that could be from it. Not even when the Dean's Way / Sandhurst area was being developed as housing. So presumably all the stone that was there was robbed and used in other places in Gloucester. So, you know, it might be around, but just we don't know the context of it. The last green space in Kingsholm, which is behind the house there, that's number 13 Kingsholm Square. So that area will be a prime target for future archaeology if anything's ever done there. You know, I know there a while ago there was a talk about putting some trial test trenches, but I don't think it was ever done. And if you don't know what that area is, it's just behind Kingsholm Court. It's quite a lovely little green space. So medieval times, apart from the Saxon Normal Palace, which was linked to Gloucester by a road, most of the rest of Kingsholm probably stayed agricultural. However, it's thought that there are some good sort of suburbs arose out of the town in the Anglo-Saxon period. And the main evidence are the streets that lay out. So you're looking at Hare Lane, which lead northwards. We also know that there were 2 medieval manors on the area, Kingsholm Manor, which is on the site of the Great Hall, and also the lesser-known Tulwell Manor, which was just north of what would become the Alvin Gate, so around about the sort of the junction by the Coach and Horses and the later vinegar factory, which we'll look at. It was from the medieval that we've got the earliest record of Kingsholm. The first one we have in the archives is quite a badly decayed grant of about 1200 to the Hospital of St Sepulchre, which was on London Road, and that was witnessed by somebody called Peter of the King's Hall. I couldn't photograph that one. It's that bad. It's really, really decayed, sadly. But not long afterwards, we've got this one. So Peter was witness to another land grant in the same year, where he was recorded as Peter of Kingsholm, and that's visible at line 9 at the end of that deed. I know you won't be able to see that, so there you go. That's the first sort of written evidence. So Pegrode Kingsholm there. Moving on a bit further, subsequent deeds reveal the evolution of this name, how it came about. This is one from 1240. It's a grant. It records as Kingsholm. I like it, incidentally, because it records an ancestor of mine, Robert of Putley. And this is the thing you can see there. It's actually Hugh of Kingsholm. You can see it on the left-hand side there. And my Robert of Putley is the bottom right one there. So Putley is a very long-winded one there. The first recorded exchange of land in Kingsholm we have took place around about 1250, when William, son of William the Parmenter, which was a tailor of Kingsholm, granted 4 acres of arable land and a messuage to Herbert the Mercer, who was a burgess of Gloucester. The land itself was in a field called Padmersfelt, and it may have been southwest of Kingsholm, sort of the St Catherine's Dean Way area, because it lay next to land owned by St Bartholomew's. It's very difficult this time to figure out where all these pieces of land were, because they very often get described as, you know, all that land in the field line next to this land owned by so and so. So it's very difficult to trace where this is. John Rhodes, who's a historian of Gloucester, does some very good work into this. There's lots of stuff available on the transactions of the Bristol Archaeological, I can't say archaeological today, can I? Bristol Archaeological Society, which are available online. Tulwell Manor I'd mentioned earlier, it was owned by St Oswald's Priory for a while. It's quite small, only worth about 20 shillings a year. It's 1218, and again, not very big, about 86 acres in extent. But you know, we know it was scattered throughout the area. So there is some in St Oswald, also some up to St Leonard's. Kingsholm Manor, on the other hand, was held by the king via the King's Barton Manor, which is the Barton Street area, and included land more locally, so Kingsholm, Longford, and Twigworth. During the 1200s, we know it was held by the Daubney family, though in 1388 it was forfeited after Elizabeth Daubney, who was also heiress of Hinton Daubney Manor in Hampshire. She was executed by burning for the murder of her second husband, Andrew Wharton. And there's more information of that online, which we really can't go into today. By the 1600s, the Kingsholm Manor came into the estate of Sir William Cook of Hineham Court, but like a lot of manors, it gradually became fragmented through sales and marriages. And in 1890, when it was William Goodrich, when he died, it was offered for sale in numerous locks and broken up completely. Tulwell Manor, which was small to start with, also disintegrated the same way, and by the 1770s was just a very small 3/4 of an acre farm. It was rented by the Dean of Gloucester, and he sublet it to various other people. By the 1850s, its name, for unknown reasons, changed to Castle Grim. We don't know why that name was, why it was changed that name. There's lots of various theories about it. It was an old building that looked a bit dark, etc., etc. But you know, Castle Grim's future was assured. In 1891, the whole estate was sold to Gloucester Rugby Club, which we'll look at a bit later. Some of the manorial records for Kingsholm have survived. They include this one, it's the survey of the manor from 1607, and we've also got some of the manorial court leet records in another collection. The court leet's a little bit different. These were sort of the hold the view of frank pledge, which was basically the oaths of peacekeeping that villagers would actually, or manorial citizens would undertake. It would also receive notices of accusations of crimes in the manor and punish those crimes committed. By crimes, these were usually sort of failure to carry out orders of the court. So a typical survey is this one. Did become, they're all written in Latin until 1733, I think, when they became English. But this is a typical example. It lists sort of occupiers, field names, pasture and meadows. There's a nice difference between those. So pastures, which are actually grazed meadows but are not cut, while meadows, called pratum, are cut for hay and may or may not be grazed. So this is the sort of information you can find. Sadly, you've got to be conversant in Latin to be able to read them. The Court Leet records. This is an example here. You'll notice there in English. So post 1733, all this stuff began to be written in English. The manorial system is winding down really at this time, but they still present some fascinating things. This is an example of a typical Court Leet business. I'll just let you have a quick read of that while I have a slurp, as Keith Floyd used to say. So what's interesting about this one, this is a typical business. Somebody's come up to the sort of the manorial court and basically said, well, you know, look at that ditch. It's totally overgrown. It's flooding. It's going to cause problems. So manorial court probably gone out, had a look at it, agreed with it. So they presented it at the next jury meeting and saying it's adjacent to Mr. Wood's ground on here. He should actually clean this. So he should actually clear it by Christmas. So this is October, so he's got a couple of months to do it. Otherwise, we're going to fine him 1 shilling a lug. I had to do some research to find out what a lug was. And the lug is basically a rod or a perch. So it's about 5.5 yards, 5 meters. Interesting that they've used the word rid as opposed to clear. You know, so you've got ridding, which, you know, for riding, what's that all about? But yeah, so it's different names. And you find one of the things with manors is very often they do have their local names for things, which can sort of cause problems. Field and place names around Kingsholm. Kingsholm actually means King's Water Meadow, so it doesn't refer to the Royal Hall, although it was obviously part of the Royal Manor of Kingsholm, and the manor house was on the same site, Leighton Manor House. Some undated names at the bottom there: Snakey / Snake Lane. Presumably there are lots of snakes there, and Portlocks piece, which again I don't know the origin of that one. However, other local place names. So in the 1600s, the Manorial Survey, which distinguished between fields and meadows. So we well as pasture and the meadows, we've got fields and meadows. So field is technically open country free of woodland or habitation, while meadow, again, is land cultivated with grass, usually intended to be mown for hay, or an area of low-lying vegetation, especially near a river. So in the Kingsholm, you had fields, so all those, so Westfield, Barmead, Pedmore's Field, Innsworth Field, Whitecross Field, Burcott Field, Elbridge Field, Cowbridge Field, and Brookfield. Presumably the Archers family weren't there then. Meadows, you have Wallenmead, Daymead, and Westmead. So have all those. By the 1700s, you've got new ones coming in: White Barn, Whitecroft, Pound Piece, Mr. Guise's Barn, Longhay, Barmet Hay, Allams, Pleck, Wilcox Lanes, Cowmeads, and Lower Platt. We know then by 1800s, you've also got these: Corn Westfield, West Honiot, North Honiot, and the Gallows Lane area. So you get one of the things you can find out through these various manorial surveys and old records is the sort of the field names. There is no tithe for the area because it was enclosed, but some of the actual enclosure records do have other fields. So I just wasn't able to look for them on there. Civil War period. For Kingsholm inhabitants, the first sign of the war, probably on about the 5th of August 1642, when the City Council ordered that from that day the city gates were to be locked at night and barred with chains. Kingsholm residents enter the city via the now lost Alvin Gate, which on the map here is the little gate right on the top there. That lay on the Tewkesbury Road junction, roughly on St Catherine Street and Skinner Street, right next to the Coach and Horses pub, which you can see the drawing down here. So what we do know is that this is the city had to actually order these gates to be rebuilt, because the Alvin Gate especially was really a toll gate as opposed to taxing people bringing goods in and out, rather than a defensive structure. So they had to rebuild it and had to order chains. And we've got records of all these in the borough records, which make quite interesting reading. 10th of August 1643, so not many days afterwards, the Royalist army arrived sort of piecemeal around Gloucester. Most of the action at the time took place at the East Gate, where the city was summoned to surrender. Not surprisingly, they refused. We didn't want to surrender to the king when we were parliamentary for city. But straight afterwards, when the messengers got back in, the city sent soldiers out, planning the garrison, and on a pre-decided plan, and they fired the sort of the suburbs that surrounded the city on all sides where they could. They pulled down buildings. We know that 241 houses were burnt in total with other buildings. In Kingsholm, we know of at least 11 houses and a barn were fired and pulled down at this time. In addition, sluice gates on the Severn were broken open, flooding the low-lying land on the north and northwest side of the city. So the Kingsholm side became flooded. Lots of the fields were flooded, caused a lot of damage, and it's estimated to be about £2,000 at the time. So it's about £210,000 today. And again, we'll look at that a little bit later. Battles of Kingsholm. We know that the Royalists set up 2 camps in the area at Kingsholm, either end of Denmark Road, roughly, and we know that 3 fairly violent skirmishes took place in this area. So the first one took place on the 12th of August when Captain Grey led musketeers of the Earl of Stamford's regiment out of the Alvin Gate and attacked the Western Royalist camp and fired it. They then came back to the city and the Royalists just rebuilt the camp, as they always did. A couple of days later, Captain Mallory led an attack on the Royalist battery that had been brought up near, and they spiked the guns. And spiking the guns is basically where they would sort of ram a spiked nail, ideally, of the cannon, so it couldn't be fired. Quite how permanent this was all depended on how big and how tight you could hit it in, basically. 18th of August again, more Royalist cannon were brought up, and this time made a Major Pudsey of Colonel Henry Stevens' regiment of foot and the previous Captain Grey from Earl of Stamford's. They led quite a large raid, 400 men out from the North Gate. There was a diversion put into place as well, and they attacked the Royalist trenches on that side. And again, they captured a number of Royalist officers and again, spined. After this, most of the fighting moved to the other sides of the city, so to the east and west gates. So there wasn't quite as much activity recorded in the Kingsholm area. End of the war, first civil war anyway, the city council undertook what they called a grand inquest to determine the financial impact of the war on the city. The mayor and the aldermen all agreed that the governor and the council of war, because it was Massey and his men, had no option but to destroy the suburbs and to flood the meadows on the north and northwest sides of the city in the siege. They then drew up a list of all the houses and places that were damaged and burnt, and this is the list for Kingsholm. In total, they calculated the losses sustained by the city, which is at the bottom of that page there, £28,720, just under 3 million today. But they also stated that this didn't cover everything, and that sort of, the losses were over and above that, and many of the people are in much want and misery in the city. The people never got paid to the same extent. I think it was a much less figure they received, but some money did come back. Kingsholm, the inquest recorded that at least 12 houses, 3 barns, a stable block, orchards and several trees were destroyed, and the cost amounted to about £4,300, about 446,000 today, of which say 200,000 of that, or 2,000, was the actual damage caused by sort of the drowning the meadows of the area. Boundaries, a very faint one this is, unfortunately, but we know the Kingsholm boundaries have always been a bit fuzzy. In 1607, this is from a Manorial document. This is the sort of the hamlet was said to lie within the parishes of St Mary and St Catherine in the city of Gloucester, and further extends itself up to the parishes of Sandhurst and Hatherley in the county of the city of Gloucester. We know that in closure in 1799, most of Kingsholm, including Twigworth and parts of Longford, were in St Catherine, Oswald's, and with parts lying within St Mary de Lode, which became, which was originally represented by lands of Gloucester Abbey. And they settled this boundary, eventually deciding that the main road leading northwards from Gloucester, anything to the west of that was St Mary de Lode, anything to the east being St Catherine's. At this time, obviously, Kingsholm was not a separate parish. A few little quick facts for you here. In 1672, only 8 houses were liable to half tax in Kingsholm, which means they were worth more than £1 a rent a year. So it means they weren't that, if there were more houses, they weren't very valuable. They probably weren't very big houses. The oldest buildings in Kingsholm are both 17th, 18th century and dates of 1700s. You've got the cottage just on the side. You've got number 13 Kingsholm Square, the origins of which date back to the 1700s. Kingsholm once had a stray animals pound, which was located in the V of the Tewkesbury and Sandhurst roads. Again, this was a manorial pound, so animals that were straying were impounded there, and people fined if they didn't come and collect them. When the Turnhouse was built there, Turnpike toll house was built there, 1822, the pound was moved to Gallows Lane, which has now become known as Denmark Road, so not Gallows Lane. Presumably there were some gallows there. From 1840s onwards, Kingsholm underwent fairly rapid development, say from 30 houses in 1801 to 360 by 1861, so it's accelerated through its time. Lots of working class terraces sprung up northeast of Alvin Street, along Worcester Parade, St Mark Street, and Edbury Parade, while town houses and villas were built around Kingsholm Square. By 1880s, Dean's Walk, Dean's Way were built, and several new roads Kingsholm wouldn't allow more houses. You also get a big sort of estate started on Denmark Road. This map is the plan at the bottom is a little bit small for people to see here, but it will be in the exhibition, which will be going up in a week or so about this talk. It's a bit of bigger picture then, so you'll be able to see it. 1874, the city boundary was extended north, and Kingsholm became a ward in the city. This was partly done because it made it easy sewage and sanitary facilities of the area, and also it gave the city more inhabitants, therefore more money coming in. By the 1840s, the population was deemed to need some sort of religious guidance. So 1846, the parish of St Mark's was formed from the parish of St Catherine, St John the Baptist and St Mary de Lode, and the church was built there. Designed by Francis Nibbler, 13th century style. There's aisles and there's a vestry. This is the view of the vestry there on the right-hand side, sorry, left-hand side. It opened in 1847 after only a year being built, so it was built really quickly. And it's one of these great things that on the back of this building there are a couple of sort of gargoyles which you don't find at this time. So it's, you know, they had money to do artistic stuff as well. By 2000, the congregation shrunk dramatically, and in 2006, the diocese closed it for Anglican worship. They immediately rented it to a Pentecostal group, the Redeemed Christian Church of God, who renamed the whole building the Destiny Temple. I'm pretty sure they're still there. I don't know very much about them at all, I'm afraid. Roads in the area. This is a lovely little thing. From 1555, the Highways Act at the time made parishes responsible for maintaining their roads in their area. But Kingsholm wasn't a parish. So when a group of inhabitants, possibly under the guise of a road club, when they met to repair the local roads, which they presumably thought was in sort of poor condition and affecting trade in the area, to raise money for it, they had to seek permission from the county quarter sessions. So this is an application to the quarter sessions, so October 1772. It asks for permission for the levy a rate of threepence in the pound on all the inhabitants and landowners in the hamlet for repairing the highways. We think this was carried out. The actual quarter sessions don't record whether they were or not, but because it's been said, we think it was. There's not many others on this, actually, I found. So I think basically they did this and that was it. Of course, then when the parish formed, it became a sort of an easier way of raising money to do it. A quick look at the Turnpike Trust. The first act for repairing and widening the roads leading from the city of Gloucester towards Cheltenham and Tewkesbury was passed in 1748, and it's followed by several other acts authorising expansion, etc. They're going to be turnpikes, so this is where travellers were charged a toll to travel over a road, which was then kept in good order, using money from the tolls for maintenance and also money from the rent that they let out. Before 1823, when Worcester Street was built, access from Gloucester to Tewkesbury was via Hare Lane, and then to Kingsholm, where it split into two. So you had a low-lying route, which was via Sandhurst, Wainloads and Lower Lode, and a high route via Longford, Norton and Coombe Hill. And of course, you know, actually most people preferred the lower route, which was via Sandhurst, but of course in the wintertime that flooded so badly it was impassable, so they then had to go on the high route, and that sort of dictated how the Turnpike Trust operated. So like other turnpikes, operation of the gates was rented out to the highest bidder at an auction, and the winner undertook to pay an annual rent for 3 years and collect the tolls. Anything over and above the rent he made was pure profit, so it could be quite a lucrative business. This is an example from the Turnpike Trust minutes, so from June 1778, and it records that Thomas Jones, the innholder of Gloucester, secured the 3-year contract for the trust after bidding to pay £154 a year. What's interesting is that by 1849, the auction was up in the area of £400 to win this, so it was quite a dramatic leap, and sort of shows the sort of amount of increase of traffic that was happening on the road, and therefore how much extra money the Turnpike could generate. Got an example of typical tolls. I have to point out that the tolls payable at this gate image there is not from Kingsholm Turnpike. Sadly, one doesn't exist. This is from one at Dursley. But we know that the tolls were horses, a penny each, except when they're drawn a carriage, when it went at threepence, cattle, 10p a score, calves, pigs and sheep, 5p per score. We know that in April 1835, to allow tolls to be collected more easily at night, the trust paid for a gas lamp at the toll house, and they paid for the gas. So, you know, there's obviously quite a busy road by this time. And again, this would probably almost be the only place on the road that was actually illuminated. So again, it must have been quite a sight for locals. We also know that, like other turnpikes, if you had a wide-wheeled cart, so cart with wide wheels, you were charged less than if you had a narrow-wheeled cart. And the reason being that the wide ones help compress the road, narrow ones help dig it up. So again, it was all to do with road maintenance. 1822, this new turnpike house was built on the Kingsholm Road. It's notice where it is, it's on the V, so it splits. You've got a Sandhurst route on the left, Longford right on the right. So they could now cover both routes. Previously, they were sort of further down, it didn't work as well. We know that when the trust was round up, 1871, County Council took over the highways, and so the rest is history. I've read recently that a pothole is repaired every 17 seconds in the UK. I'm not sure how often it was repaired then, probably less, but less traffic. A little bit about industry in the area. Below Kingsholm, the main sort of soils are the Cheltenham sand and gravels. We know they've been extracted for many years. In the history of Gloucester, Fosbrook in 1819 wrote that the gravel has been worked for many years. It seems likely that it was worked by the Romans and it continued. The enclosure map there, you can see, I keep going back to this, you can see this on Know Your Place. You can't see the actual documents that named the field, but we know that the fields around here, gravel pit ground, gravel pit road, were all around there. So we know it was going on at the time. And again, the picture is just an idealized thing of what the area might have looked like in terms of hillocks and stuff. As urban development took place, most of these were backfilled, so they, we don't have any evidence of them on the surface today. Parchment industry. Board of Health map for 1850, again available, Know Your Place, shows this fantastic parchment manufactory. It's got tanning pits, fleshing and splitting shops, fitting and shaving shop, drying sheds. We know it was there. We know very, very little about its operation. So, for example, we don't know who ran it. It might be in the city rent books, but it's a lot of material to look through just to try and find this. But we do know that it closed by 1870, and it would have been, I imagine, it would have been pretty horrendous to walk by this place. The smell must have been dreadful. We also know there was some small-scale tanning and fulling mills operational on the Twyver, which comes into Kingsholm and is then culverted throughout most of its area. You can still see it just on the edge of the rugby club. That's about it. Although we think these are mainly sort of small cottage industry, so they've probably left no records at all. Vinegar and pickle industry, 1870, John Stevens opened up this vinegar and pickle factory at St Catherine Street on the site of the old Parchment Works. Started to employ a modest amount of people to start with, but by 1901, over 400 were employed there. And we know that, so 1887, the site was rebuilt, and we have the plans in the archives of rebuilding. And this is an example of one of the offices that local architects, Moore and Maberly, built for the factory. 1901, it was described as, in classic Victorian style, purveyors, manufacturers, packers, bottlers, and manufacturers of or dealers in pickles, jams, marmalade, fruit, sauces, soup, jellies, foodstuffs, provisions, confectionery, etc. It kept going. We know that Stevens died in 1911, and in 1919, the company was due to be voluntarily wound up to allow a reconstruction, although this didn't happen, and eventually actually continued trade until 1935. Iron foundries. Seems odd that in the middle of the city, essentially, you've got iron foundries, but there are once two in the Kingsholm area. There's the Alvin Iron Works, which is on Alvin Street, which is on the site of the Heritage Hub today. That was owned by Henry Smith Crump. Started operation 1860, ended 1930. And then you have the Kingsholm Foundry on Sweetbriar Street, or Foundry Street, hence the name. It's the site is now Kingsholm Primary School. And again, that was operating in the 40s, although the dates are very iffy on some of these. The Alvin Works specialising in agricultural equipment, agricultural show medals. That's the advert from the actual Kelly's Directory. Excuse me. The sign there, which is only what I know about, it's on a door of one of the static carriages at the GWR site at Toddington, so you can still go up there and see that. We think that the demand for metal in World War I caused the demise of this business, but again, we're not 100% sure. The Kingsholm Foundry opened in around 1855 by J.M. Butt & Co., who was originally from Stroud, Dunbridge, and that specialised in pipes, guttering, bollards, drain covers. Many of those survived. That was in London Road. I took a picture of it a couple of weeks ago. They also made the pillboxes, and there's about 4 or 5 of those scattered around the country. By 1863, the company was quite large, had a showroom in Market Parade, but again, it was sold to Alfred Danks in 1917, and a few years later, Danks merged with the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, and the foundry was closed, although it remained a derelict building for many years afterwards. It was eventually transformed into a playground, although many of the local residents did not like that at all. And there's sort of in the borough records, there are a fair few complaints about children messing around on this and doing damage to the buildings and trees. So again, nothing changes with teenagers. And we think, we're not 100% sure, but we think the iron pillars and the downpipe gutters we have at the Heritage Hub came from this foundry. Seems the right sort of date for us, but we'll say, again, we'll never know, because when these were removed and we looked at them, we couldn't find any identification, but it seems likely. Market gardening. Growing population in Gloucester, great for market gardening with the rich, fairly easy draining soils in the area. So you've got this development of sort of market nursery gardens in the area. We think they were prior to 1800s. Night soil from the city was used for manuring. And the most famous one was James Wheeler, operated there in the 1790s onwards. 1859, he had sites on Alvin Street, Denmark Road, and several other places, and was providing fruit trees to the royal family, Osborne House, and at Windsor. And one by one, these nurseries were closed as the area developed, and eventually the whole business stopped. This is a little shot from Corsten's 1843 map, and it's just an idea showing you where Kingsholm was before massive development took place. And you can see at the top right hand side there, Wheeler's Nurseries occupies a huge area. And again, if you see this on the exhibition in detail, you can see you had several others there as well. World War II. 1940, the Army requisitioned the recreation gang at Kingsholm, initially for an anti-aircraft battery, but this was changed to a searchlight. So that area was fenced off, air raid shelter, Nissen huts, corrugated iron was developed, walkway, offices, workshops, hard standing. It was operated mainly by the 68th Searchlight Regiment from the 1st Rifle Battalion and Monmouthshire Regiment. Interestingly, after the war, the Army tried to sell the Nissen huts to the county council who weren't interested in buying them, so they were just demolished and removed. ARP in World War II, we had 2 posts in Kingsholm, and there's a couple of extracts here from post 6F, recording bombs on the 16th of January, incendiary bombs, and again bombs on the 12th of October, which was a raid on the GAC factory. Again, there's lots of these are good reading, and on the exhibition you'll see the actual reference members you can order these. Moving on to sport and tennis, it's not just rugby in Kingsholm. You've got the tennis club established in Kingsholm Square by the 1890s. We don't know a huge amount, although we have some lovely photographs. And the Kingsholm Square, to me, looks a lot bigger there than it does today. And a cricket club formed in 1925, and this is the first book from them. And again, there is a history of this club in the archives. Can't mention Kingsholm without mentioning Gloucester Rugby, obviously. And the football club, as it was known then, was formed in 1873, only later became Gloucester Rugby Club Football Club. And although, say, Kingsholm's now indelibly linked to Kingsholm, we know the club didn't play its first games there. They played at the Spa Field in Gloucester, and it wasn't until 1891 they actually moved to Kingsholm. The first game was played on 10th of October 1891, and as they say, the rest is history. And if you're interested in the history of Gloucester Rugby Club, the best place to go is the Gloucester Rugby Heritage site. Everything there is to know about Gloucester, a massive amount of work. I think it's something like 500,000 hours they've actually worked there. So it's a brilliant site, thoroughly recommend it. A couple of slides about that. Basically, rugby aside, a lot happening at Kingsholm. Probably the most famous one was when this French aeronaut, Professor Gaudron, brought his balloon to Kingsholm in 1895 for the bank holiday. Over 5,000 citizens were able to make a tethered ascent and get a bird's eye view. So it must have been quite fascinating for this. The following day, he was going to offer a free flight, so untethered flight, but poor weather meant only one person, the event organizer, could go. So they did take off, and they eventually ended up near Chipping Norton. So much to everybody's amazement, it was reported in the citizen at the time. And lastly, we got this. You'd never find it today because Kingsholm's got a partly plastic pitch, but they used to let the ground out of the season for actually sheep grazing. Only sheep, mind you, no cattle, presumably because they would do too much damage. So again, this is part of the collection from the rugby club, which we saved when the new stand was rebuilt. It's got lots of it. I thoroughly recommend you have a look. Go back to the Rugby Heritage site and do it there. So that's come to the end of the talk. Sorry, it's been a bit of a real run through that. And there's a lot, so when I started it, there was a lot of information I didn't have and I found too much. And I thought I can't leave that out. But I hope you've enjoyed it. And again, we're happy to try and use the chat facility now if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So I'm just going to get the view so I can see everyone who's in the meeting. If you've got a question and would like to take off so that we can see you, so put your camera on if you want to raise your hand. John, a couple of things came in through the chat. The first was from Jane Orr, who wanted to ask about the Iron Age river crossing at Kingsholm. What kind of crossing was that?
It was probably a ford, I would think. You might have had sort of further down the river, you have what they call the benches, like stone bench, where there's rock ridges come to the surface. So there might have been a harder gravel bed by chance there, but given the nature of the river at that point, you saw have a bore running up there. I suspect most of that would have been removed. It was gravel. So it was probably just a shallow crossing which they used, in which they were able to cross fairly safely at the right tide, I would think.
Thank you. And Jane also wants to point out that the tennis club in Kingsholm Square is still there, and she lives on Edwy Parade, which obviously goes down to the square, doesn't it?
That's right, yeah.
She's wondering why it was named after King Edwy, King of England from 955 to 959. Any ideas?
I don't know. I mean, the naming of these streets and roads is largely done sort of, by the council, with often public throwing words into it. Let's have it named after this. So it could be. I've never really thought about that. I know somebody used to live on Edwy Parade, and she's a local historian, so I'll have to go and pester her to see if she knows. So if we do find out, we'll let everybody know via a tweet or something, or a Facebook post. But it could be something to do with that, I guess. I don't really know.
Candia was asking, do we know where the gallows were on?
No, I'd love to find out where they were. I would suspect it's down the western end, I would think. The reason being, if they moved the pound to that area, it probably got called Gallows Lane because they were that end rather than the Wootton end, which is where you had the leper cemeteries and the leper hospitals that end. So I suspect it was down this western end. I didn't mention highwayman. Talk just accelerated away from me, but we do have a report of one highwayman operating in that area, and the great story about him is one day he robbed a vicar of Herefordshire, who was walking back home that night. Highwayman robbed him, galloped off. So the vicar thought, well, I can't go on because I can't buy any food at a local pub on the way home. So he started walking back towards the Turnpike, at which point the highwayman came back to him and gave him some money to get through the Turnpike. So, whether this highwayman was subsequently caught and then executed and then gibbeted at the end of Gallows Lane, that's probably what happened, but we've got no evidence for it, sadly.
Thank you, John. Christina, I think I can answer your question about whether the talk will be going online, and that is yes, probably within the week. All our talks and things go up via our website. So we have to do a little bit of topping and tailing editing, and that sometimes takes a few days, but it will definitely find its way online in the next week or so. Oh, there's something, SJ, you can't get their video working. But it says, gravel production aside, is there any evidence for other industrial activity during the medieval period in Kingsholm?
Not that we know of. I mean, there's probably fulling going along the Twyver, I would think. That's almost certain. But we've got no other real evidence. There is some evidence of a bronze or copper smithing operation in the Roman period, I believe, on sort of the northwest side around about the Coppice Corner site. There's some evidence on that. If you have a look onto the transactions, the Bristol Archaeological Society BGAS transactions number 130, there's an article by Carolyn Hayway, that's the name, isn't it? Yeah. About the late Roman cemeteries there. In that, she mentions this smithing site, but I couldn't really. It's very lacking information we have on the area. The Victoria County History, which is online now, it's always great to look at this. That's a little bit vague. Part of the problem is Kingsholm for many years wasn't Gloucester, and it was sort of outside, so there's not a huge amount of information recorded on it. There might be something maybe in the early Manorial Records, just saying about money for tidying up something, or somebody's going to be fined if they did a little bit of work there, they didn't tidy up. But trouble is, to look at that, you've got to be able to speak and read Latin quite easily, and that's beyond me. I mean, my Latin comes from Asterix cartoons. So,
why am I not surprised?
Yeah. So there might be something there, but it'd be interesting to find out if somebody could go through those records, Manorial Records, in detail. It'd be wonderful. It might find something there, but I suspect we will never know.
There's just one more, I think, John, and that's from Jonathan, who I know lives in Kingsholm. I've seen reference to a Heathville estate in the east part, he says, and he wonders if you know any more about that.
Not off the top of my head. I would imagine it's got to be, I would say it was built at the same time and named Heathville Road. And I don't know sort of why Heathville is called. I would suspect it's a city councillor proposing a new road with some estates there. There might be material in the Gloucester Borough records, which I believe, fingers crossed, we might be getting a grant to sort of actually catalogue properly in the next year or two. But there might be something in there. I would say, again, have a look at the Victoria County History. It's got, go on. So it's British. What's the website now? It's British History Online, Gloucester VCH. Put that in. You'll get to all the editions for Gloucestershire. Gloucester City of Gloucester is Volume 4. Search Heathville and see what comes up. I would suspect it's a councillor who's actually proposing an estate there. All that they've named the road after me. A bit like Vicar of Diddley with a golf course and everything. But
okay, any more? Let me just check the chat. That looks like it, I think. Okay, well, thank you very much, John. That was really interesting. I learned a lot, as always, from hosting your talks. And thank you all, everybody, for coming. Look out for this one going up online. Oh, John, did you want to say?
I was just going to say, Jane is just more about the. We try and do an exhibition after every one of these talks. So the one at the moment is all about, I think it's the country houses of South Gloucestershire still. In a week or so, when I finish writing it, that will be going up on the website. So it will be up there and available, Jane. So yeah, you will see it.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I'll stop recording.